Intentional camera movements are a really fun way to play with shutter speeds, whether it's an exciting subject or an uninteresting subject. So intentional camera movements are using the camera and moving it intentionally, either handheld or on a tripod. And you can use anywhere from a quarter of a second shutter speed up to a second. And most commonly, intentional camera movements can include zoom pulls, moving up and down, as well as spinning the camera. So I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate real quick the zoom pulls. So I've set up, this is indoor lighting, so there's not a whole lot of light. I've been able to set up my camera at a 1 second shutter speed. That's kind of my go-to shutter speed for zoom pulls. If I'm doing the up and down or the twist, oftentimes it's closer to a quarter of a second, but it really varies on how much light's available. So I'm at 1 second, and that gives me an aperture of f11, and I have the zoom lens focused on my stuffed animal. And when I go to press the shutter, I'm just going to start zooming slightly before I press the shutter, and then I get the pull. What's really fun is you can do faster or slower. You can zoom in or out. And you can even make a point of hesitating slightly to get a little bit more of the start or the end of the image to kind of burn in if you'd like. So quite a few different opportunities to do this. I do recommend using it on a tripod. Otherwise you'll get some motion up, down, left and right as well, and that may not work with your subject. But it's all about creativity, so feel free to hand hold it as well. Something that does simplify a little bit more is if you have a shutter release, especially when you're on a tripod, because then like you saw here, I don't have to be touching the camera and risking any unwanted camera movement. When it comes to the up downs, it's as simple as going up and down. Like I said, I like to use a quarter of a second. And then if I want to do a spin, I would just focus on the subject and then rotate the lens. Here are a few more examples to zoom pulls. And this example in nature is a full 1 second photo. And another example, this one's using bulb mode, actually a 3 second photo. And then I changed the white balance to add something a little bit more creative. Our up-down method, quarter of a second with the aspen trees. And here's another variety of that. Nice little rotational spin at a quarter of a second. And even man-made gates can work as well, as long as there's good light behind it. Christmas lights are always a favorite. Multiple different varieties with different trees and other ornaments, and pulling at different speeds. California Adventure, some neon, always great fun. A little over a second there. And in Tucson, some more neon, a couple different varieties. In-camera effects include things such as HDR, where the camera will take an overexposed image and then an underexposed image, and it will blend them together. Sometimes that feature only outputs a JPEG image, but depending on your camera, you might even start seeing some RAW, or where you can actually process the images after the fact. Another feature that more and more digital cameras are getting today are focus stacking. So traditionally this was done by capturing separate little focusing points in the camera itself and then blending them all after the fact. But today many new cameras offer this automated feature. So it will actually take multiple images at different focal depths, and then it will stack them all together to give you the sharpest image possible. Many cameras also have all kinds of fun filter effects. So start taking a look at that menu and figure out what your camera has to offer. Using oil and water is a great way to create abstract images. So I'm going to go through the different supplies and the gear needed, and we'll take a look at some sample photos. So to start off, you do want something to hold your water, and I use just regular tap water. And I do prefer to have something that's deeper, such as a fish tank, but I have used shallower dishes like baking dishes or bowls like this before too.
So you just want to add water to it and then add some oil. We will add some dish soap too, and I'll explain that purpose in just a moment. When it comes to otherwise the gear, you want to have some colored paper or anything with color. I've used aluminum foil, I've used roses, I've used construction paper, so kind of anything with color that gives you inspiration. And then when you go ahead and pour in some of the oil on the top, you're going to notice it balls up into circles, and then you'll see refraction of the colors through those circles of the oil. And when it comes to gear, you're going to want your camera. I recommend either a telephoto lens or a macro lens because that will help blur out the background, which is on the ground. You'd like to see less of that and more of just the detail in the bubbles. I like to use a shutter release so that way I can come around and view what the camera's viewing, and I can even use a Q-tip to move some of the oil balls into the frame if I'd like. I also often use live view because that makes it easier for me to focus, manual focus. When it comes to camera settings, shallow depth of field, so f4, f2.8, depending on what your lens is capable of. And then you do want to have a shutter speed of at least 1/60th of a second. So if you're in a low lit environment, you want to bring in some more lights or use off-camera flash. Otherwise, the slight movement of the bubbles, you're not going to get a clear, sharp image. Always on a tripod, of course. And looking at my tripod, I have a center column that pulls out that allows me the flexibility to look straight down and get a nice level image where the lens is parallel to the water level. All right, so once we have the oil and the water, the purpose of the dish soap, I'll just put a little dot onto my Q-tip and then tap it down into the water, and that is going to cause surface tension. So my little oil bubbles are going to have a much more defined shape. And you'll see some examples of before and after. Once I'm all set up, let me just turn on my live view. And I do like to use manual focus. And if your camera has it, zoom in on the manual focus as well, and then you can make sure the lines of each bubble are sharp. And that's all it takes. Feel free to go ahead and enhance colors slightly if you need to, or crop just a little bit in post-processing.
So let's take a look at a few more examples of oil and water. These first three examples do not have dish soap, so the edges are less defined than what you'll see on the remainder of the images. Again, a combination of foil, construction paper, some cloth, anything that provides color. This example is before any post-processing. You can see some little pieces of dust and such in there, so I did use Photoshop to do a lot of cleanup. And here's another setup when I use my larger fish tank and some off-camera flashes. So there's a lot of flexibility and a lot of opportunity of different ways of setting this simple abstract opportunity up. A couple last examples here. That's the Christmas napkin, construction paper, and more construction paper.
To capture a good clean photo, it's all about the background. And so anytime you're on location with small objects or in a studio setting, you really want to pay attention to the background. Some of the simplest things can be used for backgrounds. So a piece of foam board, it's even a used piece, but that works as well. Mat board that we use for matting photos, really simple. You can use colored paper. So depending on what your subject is, maybe a pop of color would be the appropriate backdrop. I always have pieces of glass hanging around, as well as plexiglass. So I like to have plexiglass, the black, really nice reflective material, so you can put subjects on that and then get a great reflection. If you don't have black plexiglass, you can always use regular glass or regular plexiglass and put black paper underneath it, and you'll get the same effect. Or any other color for that matter underneath it. If you don't have a piece of glass, sometimes you can just take a picture frame and take the glass out of a picture frame, use it for some photos, and then put it back into the frame. Through secondhand stores and dollar stores, I come across other things that work well, especially for small subjects. This is a piece of felt used for jewelry often, and I got it at a discount store. Any materials store you go to, you can grab some of their remnants or seconds. This happens to just be an old sheet. So if I'm using flash, I can use it to put the flash through it and then it becomes a diffuser. Or I've used it as a backdrop with flash. So that way it makes a really nice white, clear background. And of course I would want to either put it in a dryer or iron it or something like that so I wouldn't have the wrinkles. And so those are really easy to get at a fabric store, as well as some basic black cloth. I've used this for photographing ukuleles and several other subjects. As long as it's larger than the subject you're going to photograph, you can hang it behind a chair. If you have a light stand, you can use that. You can clip it to something. It's pretty easy, and if you get creative, that you can use just about anything for backdrops. I have even used some old paint tarps, and they've provided some great texture and simple backgrounds. So get clever with it and take a look and see what you have on your shelves.
So here's an example for a background using plexiglass and some off-camera flash. And here's a sample as well with a nice reflection from the black plexiglass. And you can even use black cloth as a background, just hang it up, for example, for this smoke picture shot with off-camera flash. And here are the ukuleles, and you can see in the bottom left-hand corner just the edge of the cloth that was not covered. So a simple little crop, and that black cloth made a great backdrop. Here's an old paint tarp, and once I added a gel to it, it became a far better background. And some white foam board for this leaf, charred leaf, as well as some sunglasses. You can even use blackboards on location, outdoors. Just put it behind your background. This was an example of using off-camera flash in conjunction with the blackboard. Refraction projects. All you need is a little bit of water, some kind of glass material, and some nice backdrops and possibly reflection from underneath. So this particular setup is purple and green paper taped to a wall, and then black plexiglass, a funny looking glass filled to the brim with water, and a couple off-camera flashes. This can be done with regular lights as well. You just have to be very careful to minimize the reflections. So the lights are generally placed behind the glass, out of sight, so that way it doesn't reflect onto the front of the glass. So looking at the setup here, you can see it a little bit better now. Keeping all black around it helps to minimize any unwanted reflections. And then the flash units themselves, you can see they are aimed at pointing towards the background and not at the glass itself specifically. And here's an example of a finished product of just the stem of that glass. The key is to get it lined up so that way you are on parallel to the subject, so the lines break up where you want them to. That way they flip and refract. Here's an example using multiple wine glasses, and in order to get that center one upside down, I filled that glass first, put the piece of plexiglass on top of it, then flipped it all upside down, set it down in place, and then added the two glasses on either side. And then when it came to taking it away, I did the same thing, moved the two that I could, and then flip this back over right side up, and then I could empty the water. And a few more examples, finished versions. As well as you can add patterned paper, which looks really cool. This is just some scrapbooking paper that Michael's had on sale, incorporating different shapes. And again, the refraction inside these vases is just refraction itself from the colored paper. So that's what happens when it goes through water. And it helps that the vase has slight curves to it as well. These are, again, sometimes I pick these up at dollar stores or at Michael's, some craft store like that. And then you can even do a little trickery. In this case, I put some of the blue paper and actually taped it to the back of the jar on the left. And so you can see you still get a little bit of refraction even in the image on the right, or the jar on the right, but just kind of added a little bit more fun to the overall refraction project. Okay, milk, food coloring, and dish soap. Pretty simple project, and most of the supplies are on hand. So let's go ahead and talk about the supplies. I use milk with a fat content, regular food coloring, and dish soap. I like to use a bowl that's non-reflective, so I have a series of black bowls that I've picked up at secondhand stores or dollar stores, and that just helps me to eliminate any unwanted reflections. My camera gear, I'm using a macro lens, but telephoto lenses work, or even a little wider lens, and then you'll crop into your finished product. And I'm using a tripod. Notice that the lens, the end of the lens, is parallel to the surface of the milk, and that's crucial to get the best focus possible. I'm also using off-camera flash that provides a majority of the light that I need, and I've got some white foam boards reflecting more light. If you don't have off-camera flash, this can be done maybe near a bright window, somewhere where there is some bright light. Because of the movement of the milk, once we get going, you'll see that a faster shutter speed is necessary, so anywhere between 1/100th and 1/200th of a second. Depth of field doesn't matter too much. It's going to be pretty shallow because you're just photographing the surface of the milk. I do prefer to use a shutter release because when the chemical reaction occurs, I want to have one hand on the shutter release, the other hand on the dish soap Q-tip. So let's talk about that chemical reaction. We've got milk with a fat content, and then we added a few drops of food coloring. You can try to focus on the food coloring, but it's going to constantly permeate into the milk, so it's hard to tell if you have a sharp edge. So I will often rest a toothpick on the top surface of the milk, focus on the toothpick, remove the toothpick, and then add my food coloring. Then I know I'm in sharp focus, and then using a Q-tip, I'll dab it into some dish soap, and then with my shutter release in one hand, I will rest the Q-tip into the milk, and I will watch the chemical reaction of the colors, the milk and the dish soap, avoiding each other and taking the colors with it. So let's look at some samples. Here are just the drops of food coloring, and here's the start of mushrooming. After the chemical reaction slows down, you can even use a little stir stick and slightly move the milk and the food coloring around to create different pictures and images. Sometimes you get little air bubbles. Notice these are not, because it's permeating into the milk, it's not a tack sharp edge, and that's just the properties of the milk with the food coloring, so that's normal. All right, this next project is really fun, and it uses paper and different colors of lights, which are really simple to adapt. And so in this particular image, it is a folded paper, and I have focused on the edge of the paper. So let's take a little closer look here. So as you see in the picture, I do have two off-camera flashes. However, I'm going to show you some other ways to modify this, and hot lights work just as well. But notice one flash has a red gel and the other flash has a blue gel. My paper is just several sheets of paper stapled and paper clipped in a certain way to create some fun shapes. I like the curves. And then I am using a macro lens, but a longer telephoto lens will work as well. You just want to focus on the front edge of the paper. Looking at a few more examples, here's that one close up, and you can actually see the little tears if I had torn a sheet of paper or if it has a rough edge. And then you can get a little more fancy with how your paper looks. And so I've just changed I curled the pieces of paper in on themselves to get something a little more interesting, photographed the base area, and you'll see some with the loops here in just a moment as well. So using a pretty fast shutter speed, about 1/100th of a second, and then the off-camera flash, But like I said, you can also use other things. First off, if you don't have gels, you can use anything that's colored that's somewhat transparent to put in front of a flash or in front of a light source. Notice I also have a white foam board on the ground to help bounce more light up, and then there's a white wall in the background. And here's an example where I was using the blue as the background and then the red on the right-hand side. So still using flashes, but you can always replace little hot lights, little LED lights, anything like that in place of the flash just to get the different colors. And that gives you an example here where I've got more white in the background with a tint of blue and then the red coming from that right side. And you can get even more creative and throw some other pieces of paper, folded paper, inside the different loops and get an even more abstract, fun image. Notice the terrors up in the top right-hand corner. And that gives you a little fun project that uses just paper, light, and some kind of coloring of light. If you're looking for a challenge in your photography, then give yourself a theme. There are many online that you can search for, or if you just sit down for a few minutes, you can come up with all kinds of different random ideas, put them in a jar, and then when you need some inspiration, open up that jar and pull out one of the themes, and then go ahead and shoot that theme for the day. So here are some examples from in my kitchen. This is a corkscrew, a whisk, a steamer, and a different angle on the steamer. I love photographing food products too from in my kitchen. Or maybe in your backyard is a better choice. Finding all the little plants and bugs. And this is actually a tiny seed from a dandelion. This is at a high magnification. Or maybe it's a local park that you want to go to. If you have any water areas, you can almost always find waterfowl or birds. And maybe reflections. And that can be taken in multiple different ways. This is the more standard version of reflections. So downtown buildings, reflections off car windows, or traditional landscape with water reflections. So give yourself a challenge and fill a bowl of terms that you can get out and shoot when you need some inspiration. Okay. The bokeh or bokeh in an image is what you see blurred. So in the example of this image here, it's fairly circular, and that is determined by the shape of your aperture when the image is out of focus. This is generally what you'd get in the background. If you want to change that shape, then you need to put something over your lens.
So how do we change the shape of the aperture of a lens? Clearly, I'm not going to get inside the lens and make a change, so I just need to put something in front of it that's going to change that aperture. So it's as simple as cutting out some discs. So I have a few samples here. And here's a heart as well. So in order to create these, you want to figure out the diameter of your lens. So the easiest way is to grab your lens cap and then go ahead and trace it. And then you're just going to cut that out. I like to cut out, it's going to be just slightly smaller than what I've traced because I've traced the exterior of the lens cap and it really needs to be the interior dimensions. So I'm going to go ahead and trim this on the inside edge. If you happen to have any, like a laser cutter, that would be a great solution to this. And you can just measure your lens diameter, or many scrapbooking tools, Sizzix, Cricut, things like that can also do this for you very well, very easily. Okay, so I'm just going to test it on the end of the lens. And it fits pretty good, because then I'm going to use either gaffer's tape or some electrical tape to tape it on there. So if it doesn't fit all the way in, that's okay, but I do want a pretty decent seal. And then it's a matter of just cutting out something in the center. So if you don't have any punches, I know many craft stores have punches, whether it's little squigglies or holiday time Christmas trees or anything like that. You can grab that, or you can use an X-Acto knife. You do want to create the shape as close to the center as possible. However, you could be creative and you could put more than one shape on there and see what happens with your image. And then notice the size here. Generally, anything much smaller than this size is not going to work quite as well, but you can play with that with your lens and what you're doing. So I would go ahead and, this was cut with a laser, but I would go ahead and grab a punch or draw it out and then use an X-Acto knife. Don't forget, if you use an X-Acto knife, to get some kind of cutting mat underneath, because you don't want to destroy the table that you're working at. So once you have that set, I'm going to use the star as an example here. I'm going to place it on the top of my lens and use a little bit of electrical tape, which is non-sticky. And there we go. I'm all set. Okay, so I'm ready to use these bokeh effects, and I still have the star on the end of my lens, and it's taped down with a little bit of electrical tape. And I'm in a garage type setting where we've got a little construction going on here, but I've strung up some Christmas lights here, and that's what I'm going to be shooting, just to give you the effect of changing that bokeh, changing that aperture size. So when it comes to settings, I'm going to set my camera to manual exposure, and I want my aperture as wide open as possible. So I'm actually at an aperture of f4. And then I've practiced a few times prior to make sure I have a nice dark background. So I'm actually down at a 1/5 of a second. I do have my image stabilization on, therefore I'll minimize any camera shake at that shutter speed. And I'm gonna go ahead and zoom my lens just a little bit. When I'm ready to shoot, I do want to rotate the focus ring until I see the star shapes in the lights. If I don't do that, I'll end up seeing just the light itself. And so I do want to kind of get it, basically it's out of focus to get that nice different bokeh shape.
So here's a few examples of the bokeh effect using my star bokeh attachment. And again, zoomed in a little bit more. And then in this example, we actually spelled out POW and put that over the lens. And a few more creative aspects using a snowflake punch, and these are using Christmas lights. A spiral punch. And you can even use fill flash in the foreground. As long as you're focusing in the foreground, the background will automatically go out of focus with the shallow depth of field. And you can use this effect with portraits. Give it a try.
When using artificial lights, like flashlights, to paint with light, there are several different things to consider. First off, do you want it to be a narrow beam of light, or do you want it to be a wider beam of light? So there are some flashlights out there that are telescoping, so you can actually make it go from narrow to wide. So that's something to keep in mind. There are some lights that have multiple LEDs in it versus a single LED. So how much light do you need? What's the quantity? How high powered? What's the distance to the subject you're trying to illuminate? In many cases, these are used in nighttime photography. You just want to illuminate something in the foreground so that you don't have a complete silhouette. And so those are things to consider. Every flashlight has maybe a slightly different color cast. So you want to, if you need more than one flashlight in the same shoot, you might want to get matching flashlights so that way they have the same color white balance. If not, you can always use gels, warm gels, cool gels, whatever it is, to help change the color of the light. Or if you're doing creative aspects, then you definitely want to have some kind of gel to change the light source and the color of the light. So those are things to keep in mind when you're looking at using artificial flashlights for photography.
Light painting is all about just recording the light and the movement within the frame. So in the example image here, my son was spelling his name Grant, actually using a stick from the fire. He did have to spell his name backwards, and this was about an 8-second photo. So that's the simplicity aspect of light painting, but you can use any light source to create different effects. So this particular image, the light coming from underneath the car is actually a flash that was triggered during a 15-second photo. And the lights that you see on the front of the car, you can tell some are reflections from in the city, but the ones directly on the front are a flashlight, so painting on the light. And this example, another one in Arizona, in Jerome, is the front of the old car is light painted with flashlights, but inside the cab, we have put a little tea light that kind of flickers just a little bit, and notice the difference in the color balance of those lights. So that's kind of how light painting will work. Any night type image, you can use any light source and fill in shadows and light in a different fashion.
All right, so supplies needed for Spirograph type lighting. First off, there's many kits you can order online, but if you are more of a make it at home type person like I am, then here is my approach to it. Obviously, there's all kinds of different ways to approach it based on the supplies you have on hand. So first off, I do have fishing line, string would work just as well. I do have either gaffers or electrical tape. And then you need some lights. So the different lights that I've shown here, one is one of those neat little things for your pets. And the reason I have electrical tape around it is because if I cinch down the tape tight enough, I can make the light stay on. So I'll just demonstrate that real quick. Push the button down as I add the tape to it, and then wrap it around, and then the light stays on permanently. So then when I hang it to a string, it'll be perfect for the Spirograph lighting. So as you see, the whole idea of Spirograph lighting is as the light rotates, especially if it's on a longer string, it's going to start becoming very predictable pattern and make what we're used to seeing as some of us grew up with Spirographs. This particular one, I've done the same type thing when it comes to the tape to attach it on, but I've also added a blue gel, so it becomes a blue light source. Now the reason why I do kind of like both of these little lights is because they are a single LED light, so it makes the image a lot cleaner when I'm capturing it. And then here is the example with the fishing line attached to it. So you do want to attach it to a ceiling. You're going to have to find a dark room. Closets might work, but generally you don't have enough space for this to rotate around. So if you have a room, if it has windows in it, that's fine if you're going to shoot at night. Otherwise, find a room that maybe doesn't have any windows in it, and then find a way to attach this. I'm using an outdoor space, garage type space. So I was able to put a nail in the ceiling for mine. And then you can also get creative trying other types of lights. So here is the bicycle light that I'll refer to later, and just set up to put as on the front of a bike, and it's really kind of fun and has all kinds of great lights, flashing and colors. But if I were to just hang the light itself, it's too much of a light source and it gets too busy. It's not a clean, simple image. So that's why I use the electrical tape or gaffer's tape to narrow down the stream of light into one small spot. And then when I hung it, I was able to get a really nice pattern that changed colors throughout. If your flashlight or light source does not have a way to connect, or it doesn't have any loops or anything like that, in this case I just used a rubber band, and then I put my fishing line under the rubber band to create two separate loops. And then my larger loop that went up to the ceiling was attached to this, so therefore it would be a fairly consistent movement as it went around. But with my gear, so I have my camera set up, and notice with the tripod, and it's looking straight up. So I do want to make sure the plane of the lens is pretty level to the plane of the light as well. We will actually tap the light and have it swing around in order to take pictures of the moving light, and at a very slow shutter speed. But where it does get challenging is figuring out that focus. And so I have live view, so I can rotate my screen all the way out. If not, you might have to crawl down to the ground and get it set, or possibly set it up based on just the distance, measure the distance, and then focus, because focus is all about distance. So I could focus over there as long as it's the same distance as this is. And then lock in your focus so that won't change from image to image. I do recommend a shutter release because you're going to be going possibly beyond 30 seconds, depending on what kind of image you're after. If I wanted a full, complete rotation spirograph, that would be several minutes. Right now, the light I have in this room, I can't actually capture the images right now because I would get too much of the background. So this would be something you'd want to do in the dark. So always have some other kind of flashlight handy too, so that way you can see what you're doing. Okay, so when it comes to focus, I flipped up my screen, I can put it in live view, and then I can even zoom in on focus so that I can focus right to the tip of that flashlight. So let me go ahead and do that.
So here's a basic start to a spirograph. Notice the background is visible, so this was shot while there's still daylight. It's a good time to try it, just to get your settings right. So with the light source hanging from the roof ceiling, from fishing line, I tapped the light source so it would swing back and forth. My camera was down below it, focusing straight up, and this was about a 7-second photo. As it got dark, I changed out the light and used one of the lights with the blue gel over it, and you can start seeing the consistent pattern that can be achieved. This is a 20-second photo. And then using the bicycle light with the narrow opening, again, I'm starting to see a consistent pattern. This was another 20-second photo, but I really liked the multiple colors of lights. And then just kind of mixing up the settings a little bit and how I swing, whether I swing it more back and forth or hit a little bit more of a circular motion when I go to swing. Several of these were experiments of some of that. And this was 45 seconds. And another just slightly varied swing to the light. And you can, even in post-production, combine several images all into one final frame, like this. Using the overlay mode, blending mode, made this really easy to stack together. So there you go, spirographs. If you want a full spirograph, you'd be looking at several minutes to achieve that constant rotation and to fill it in completely. And there you have it, 10 creative photo projects. So take some of these ideas, make them your own, modify. The most important thing is to just have fun.